It is March 6th, and I have finished 3 books in March so far, so it is time to start another vlog style monthly reading wrap-up. These are videos that I do every month where I take little clips of all my impressions of the books that I've read throughout the month, as close to when I've read them as I can, and I string them together for one big long vlog. So I try to talk about the books that I've read, tell you something about them, and also let you know what I thought of them and if I think that you should read them too. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes about each book because these vlogs get super long because I read quite a few books each month. This year I am trying to read less books each month, so hopefully, ideally, these vlogs will get shorter, but that hasn't happened yet. So get a cup of coffee, get a cup of tea, strap in, settle down, have a cozy time listening to me talk about all the books that I've read in March. The first book that I finished in March was Concerning My Daughter by Kim Hee-jin, translated from the Korean by Jamie Chang. This is a very short book that came out in 2017, I believe, in Korea, and then was recently translated in the last year or so into English. This book is about a aging mother who I don't think we actually ever get her name, so she is an unnamed narrator, and she is in her 60s. Her husband has passed away. She has one grown daughter, and at the start of this book we see that this grown daughter is asking her mother for a favor to get some money, and instead of doing this favor, which would put the mother out, she says, "Why don't you come and live with me?" The problem is that our unnamed narrator is in denial that her daughter also has a partner of 7 years and is a lesbian. So the whole book kind of hinges on this mother-daughter relationship, but it's all told from the mother's perspective and how the mother feels about having to work even though she's older, having to scrape by, having to do what she can to make ends meet. One of the ways that the mother makes money is that she rents out apartments in the house that she owns. Another way is that she is a carer at a rest home / rehabilitation center. The mother, our main character, looks after Jen, who is in her 80s or 90s and in declining health, dealing with signs of and stages of dementia. But the main character has been working with Jen for a very long time. She really feels close to her, and she is really interested and intrigued by Jen's life. Jen lived a very different life than our main character. This book mostly is about our main character's internal thoughts and struggles, how she feels about having to work even though she's older, how she feels about her daughter's life decisions, and when her daughter moves in, how she feels about their living together. So it's really gloomy. It's really not a fun, happy book. It is dealing a lot with death, with being older and dissatisfied with the life that you led, and being worried for your child who might later in life become dissatisfied as well. Our main character is extremely homophobic, which is difficult to read, but I think it's done in a really interesting way and gives you a lot of insight into what true homophobia, in the true sense of the word, being fearful of something that you don't understand, being fearful of a lifestyle that you can't comprehend, is like for someone. And although sometimes our main character's decisions and thoughts and ideas, especially on homosexuality, makes you angry, most of the time you feel sympathetic for her because she is more frightened and unable to understand and unable to grasp the world as it actually is and let go of her ideas of the world as it was. Like many Korean books, and Japanese to a certain extent, but mostly Korean books that I've read, there are a lot of themes of being worried about what other people think of you and being worried about the outward appearance of your life versus how your life actually is and what you want it to be and what's fulfilling and what would make you happy. So it seems like there is a big emphasis on making your life be perceived by others as good as opposed to making a good life, which I think is an interesting reoccurring theme that I've seen in a lot of Korean literature that I've read. It also has to do with human rights and also obviously mother-daughter relationships. Like when your relationship with your children changes, how it changes, and what you can do to make that transition better or easier. Our main character feels very, very put upon by her daughters. Our main character feels like her daughter is not doing anything to lessen the pain and problems of her mother's life or take care of her mother in any way, and our main character feels like this is a little bit of her daughter's duty to do. She also feels really put upon by her daughter. She feels like her daughter is ruining her life and doing things purposefully to upset her mother and to make things harder for their relationship. She feels like her daughter is going down a bad path in general. So it's a lot about those perceptions without communication. So a lot of the times in this book, you're very frustrated that no one is actually just like talking to each other or listening to each other. They're all having these inner conflicts that are creating conflicts outside of them as well. I thought this book was excellent. I thought it was great. It was hard to read. It was not fun and light and happy, but I thought it was a really, really great book, and I definitely look forward to reading more from this author. The next book that I finished in March was The Naked Detective by Lawrence Shames. This is a very short detective story written in the early 2000s, and it is one of a series. So I guess this author created a series that follows different people in the Florida Keys, and this one happens to be about our main character, Pete, who is a retired New Jerseyan. He's divorced, he has left his career behind, and he's come down to the Florida Keys to basically do anything he wants to do, which is mostly nothing. He wants to go in the hot tub, he wants to swim in his pool, he wants to play tennis and ride around on his bike through the Keys and do not much of anything. Somehow his lawyer has roped him into the idea that he should become a private detective on paper only so that he can write certain things off on his taxes and consider himself still having a job so that he can collect certain benefits from that. He did sign himself up to be a PI, but he has never used his private detective status for any reason until one day he is sitting in his hot tub naked when someone comes in and asks for his help to solve a crime. This starts the whole adventure for Pete off where he ends up actually doing some detective work. This is a very low stakes, low energy, untaxing kind of mystery. It was interesting enough. It was interesting to put the pieces together, and I definitely liked the Florida Keys setting. I liked our main character. He was very reluctant to be a detective, reluctant to be doing the things that he was doing. It's definitely a little dated. It was written in 2000, and there's definitely some phrases and words and titles used that we would not use today. There was also definitely a kind of lingering idea that detectives are supposed to talk a certain way about women and things like that. So like, you know, there's definitely some dated ideas. There's definitely some slurs and stuff, but mostly you could get past it because mostly our main detective is a pretty open-minded guy and he is pretty thoughtful. Even as he's objectifying women, he's thinking about why he's objectifying women. Again, I thought this was like very low stakes, very fine, very fun. There was obviously murders in this book, but you never thought anything really horrible was going to happen. There was never going to be any extreme animal violence. There was never going to be any super graphic depictions of violence, and that was true of the book. So it was a fast, fun read. I think I would read more in this series if this series is what I think it is, which is just following different people from the Florida Keys and how their lives might intersect. We definitely met a few characters in this book that might pop up in other books. I haven't done any research to know that that is what this book is like, but if it is like that, I'd be fine reading another book of his if I come across it. It's not one that I'm going to seek out. The next book that I finished in March was The Color of Water, A Black Man's Tribute to His White Mother by James McBride. This book was published in 1996, and it is a memoir slash biography slash nonfiction about James McBride's mother and his relationship with his mother. I read this book for the Savage Prompts for December 2023. No, not for December. It was the bonus prompt for 2023, which was a book about a mother-son relationship. So James McBride was getting his feet as a young writer in the 90s when he decided to do this story about his mother, and it was partly inspired by the fact that his mother never talked about her past with her children when they were young, and he didn't know anything about her life before his birth, really, until he was much, much older. He would often ask questions, especially because he grew up in Brooklyn and Queens in a majority black areas where his mother was often the only white woman around. So this book is kind of split into two parts, alternating chapters, one talking interview style with his mother as she talks about various things in her life, in her past, and also as she talks about them growing up. James McBride is one of 12 children. She talks about James McBride's father, who unfortunately passed away before James was born, while James was still in utero, and then also about her next husband, who raised James as his father, but who sadly passed away when James was 13 or 14 years old. It talks all about her life through her eyes, and then James also has passages where he's talking about his life and his relationship with his mother and his growing up and their connection, what his feelings and thoughts were, and also the ways that James came to want to write this book and came to be asking these questions of his mother and finding out about his mother's past. So it's a really interesting book. I read this book on audio, and I think that's definitely the way to go, because although the audiobook narrator for James's mother was a little overdramatic, I think, and played up her Jewishness a little too much, overall, I thought it was really nice to break up the different perspectives with different narrators, and I think it really helped you keep track of what was going on in the story, because the story is not strictly linear. The parts with his mother speaking and the parts with his life don't necessarily correlate exactly into like specific areas of their life. So it was great to have the narrator and the narration signal to you what was going on by using two different narrators. I've read one other James McBride book before, and it was a collection of short stories. I really like his writing style. It's very compelling, it's very interesting, it's very engaging without being overly flowery or overly complicated writing, but also without being overly simplified writing. It feels very conversational. It feels very much like you're speaking to someone or someone is speaking to you, telling their story to you. So reading this story where they're actually telling a story to you, telling their life story to you, I think was like kind of the perfect interpretation of his simple but lovely and very accessible prose and writing style. I'm definitely interested in reading more from James McBride. If you're looking for a mother-son relationship book, if you're looking for a nonfiction about growing up as an Orthodox Jewish woman in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, or if you are looking for a book talking about growing up Black in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I would definitely highly, highly recommend The Color of Water. And those were 3 books that I read in March, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is March 13th, and I have read 4 more books in March. The next book that I read on audio, and it was The Mill House Murders by Yukio Aitsuchi and translated by Ho Lin Wong. In February, I read the first in this series, The Decagon House Murders, and that one was really fun and introduced us to our main character, our amateur sleuth Shimada, and he is back again for The Mill House Murders. There has been a murder at the mysterious Mill House, which is this almost castle or keep-like house that a reclusive artist's son lives in. So our artist's son was in a terrible accident and his face is disfigured. He's in a wheelchair. He can't move around without the wheelchair, not really. And he always wears a mask because because of his accident and his injuries. So we meet him and we hear from his perspective as he's thinking back to a year previous where there was a series of murders at the mill house. Once a year, this main character opens up his mill house, which was designed by the same man who designed the Decagon house and lived in the Decagon house and died in the Decagon house. He was a very eccentric architect, and the series follows all of his houses, which is really, really cool. The man in the mask, the man who owns the mill house, opens his house once a year. His father was a great painter, a renowned painter, and once a year he opens the house to just a few select people. He's bought all his father's paintings back from wherever they were, and he keeps them in a private collection. These few select people are able to look at the paintings except his father's very last painting, and they always kind of try to get to see that painting, but the man in the mask will never let them see it. So a year prior to when the book opens, several people were there, and many people, 3 or 4 people, got murdered, and now a year later the people who survived are coming back to look at the paintings again. The man in the mask lives with his young ward, who has recently become his wife, who was brought to the mill house as a young girl as the man in the mask's ward and has never really ventured outside. She's considered very naive, and so it's a little bit suspicious, and the guests this year are wondering why they recently got married. Of course, Shimada, our amateur sleuth, somehow insinuates himself into the current year's guests, bringing up things from the past from a year ago, and one of the people who may have been murdered or possibly went missing, who was possibly the murderer, it turns out that Shimada knows him or knew him and wants to clear his name from the murders. He is not sure if he's still alive because Shimada's friend went missing, so Shimada is there to investigate. That is the basic premise of the Mill House murders. Just like the Decagon House murders, it is very referential and very reverent of Golden Age mysteries and mystery authors in general. Of course, the Man in the Mask and Shimada share their love of mysteries. It is not as wink wink nod nod as the Decagon House was. It doesn't break the fourth wall the way the Decagon House did, but it brings up a lot of tropes and a lot of ideas of classic and Golden Age mysteries. Like the Decagon House, I knew the answer right away, and it was pretty obvious what was going on with the mystery, but also like the Decagon House, I think that it doesn't really matter. It's more about seeing how the Japanese author in the 1980s played with these classic tropes and how he paid homage to his favorite authors, mystery authors, and that golden age and that classic age of mysteries. In some ways, I think it was easier to keep track of the characters in the Mill House. I did have to make a character map because there were so many people, and again, because they're called by both their first names and last names, and because their names are in Japanese, it was almost like there was more people than there were, so it just took me a while to make sure that I matched up the last names with the first names and that I knew who the character was. So I did make a little character map while I was listening to this on audio, and that definitely helped me. I think if I had been reading it physically, it wouldn't have been as hard because visually I have a better recollection of who people are and I can make connections better if I see the words visually. I'm just a very visual learner. But once I got everybody straight, it made sense. And like I said, it was pretty obvious what the solution to the mystery was going to be, so it wasn't like I was confused on that point. These are the only 2 books that are translated into English out of this series, and I can't really tell how long this series is. I don't think it's super long, but I'm super excited for the next book in the series to be translated, and I hope that many more are translated in the future because I really am enjoying this series and I would love to continue. I feel like I love a series if I continue it pretty straight away. The next book that I finished in March was Suspicious Death by Dorothy Simpson. This is a Luke Thanet mystery. I have read 2 other Luke Thanet mysteries. Dorothy Simpson is a British author and she was writing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This book was written in 1988, and a lot of her books have maps, which I love, and they're very classic, very traditional English small town mysteries where Luke Thanet is the police detective. He is like one of the higher detectives in the force, and his sergeant lineman is his like right-hand man. And of course, a mystery happens, a death occurs, and Thanet and linemen are sent out to investigate. These very much remind me of all the BBC shows like Midsummer Murders or the Inspector Morse shows and Inspector Lewis shows, and to a lesser degree the Inspector Morse books. They follow the same premise as the Inspector Morse books in that we see Morse and he is the detective on the case and he has to go around Oxford solving mysteries with Lewis. But in the Thanet mysteries, Thanet is a family man, and a big portion of the side stories is taken up with Thanet's relationship with his wife and with his family and with his worries about his family. So we see a lot of the family reoccurring, and there is like a through story throughout these books of what is happening behind the scenes in Thanet's life. And then to a much lesser degree, we also see that about Lineman's life and Lineman's wife. So it's fun. They're very domestic. They're very wholesome. I mean, obviously people are getting murdered and bad things are happening, but like for the most part, Thanet is, you know, trying to work for the powers of good and solve mysteries. And for the most part, also the murders tend to be crimes of passion, or they tend to be, there's like a reason, like a reasonable reason why things are happening. They're not just random violence. In Suspicious Death, a career woman, a businesswoman, has moved to a small town. She's moved into like the manor house of the town, and she has made friends and enemies like at every turn. So when she turns up drowned in the river, the first thought is that she was pushed. And then Suspicious Death goes on from there, and we meet a whole cast of characters in the small town and a whole group of people who may or may not have committed this crime, and we see the drowned woman's relationship with all these people, and it's just super fun. They're super easy to read. I wouldn't say they're very fast-paced, but they are definitely not slow, and they're quite short, so they're easy to get through. One thing that I like about the Thanet mysteries, and one thing that I think people wouldn't like about the Thanet mysteries, is that you get a lot of clues, you get a lot of ideas of what's going on, but at the end of all the mysteries, Thanet figures out what's happening and doesn't let the reader in on what's happening. So you will have gotten a lot of clues, you will have gotten a lot of information, and then at the end Thanet has an epiphany and he goes off, gathers everybody, does what he needs to do or whatever to confront the killer or to capture the killer, and then at the end things are revealed in almost like an afterthought or an afterword, a postscript of, okay, and that was how we solved the mystery, and this is how I put the pieces together. But most of the time, the reader can guess who the killer is, but they can't actually solve the crime with the clues provided. So I don't mind that. I don't mind just guessing and seeing if I'm right. I don't mind not guessing or not knowing, but I know a lot of people feel a little cheated when a mystery book doesn't give you all the clues. The next book that I read is The Oxford Murders by Guillermo Martinez. This was translated from the Spanish by Sonia Soto. This book was written in the early 2000s and was made into a movie just after it was written, a couple of years after it was written. I think it was written in 2005 and it was made into a movie in 2008 with Elijah Wood. The time period of the book is in the mid-90s. Martinez is a Argentinian author, and our main character is a young Argentinian man coming to Oxford. He is a mathematician and he wants to meet some of the mathematicians that are at Oxford. He's heard a lot about them and he's excited. And one of the people that he wants to meet is Arthur Seldom, who is this famous but a little bit reclusive mathematician. Our main character does meet Seldom, and he meets a cast of characters. His landlady, who is an older woman who uses a wheelchair, her daughter who lives on the premises, a young woman who our main character ends up having a relationship with, as well as a bunch of other people. These people all come into play when the main character of this book walks home one day and finds that his landlady has been murdered. So at the same moment that he's walking home, he runs into Arthur Seldom, who's been told to go to the landlady's house. Arthur seldom knows the landlady, and they discover the body together. So the rest of the book takes off from there, and it does have a lot to do with math and a lot to do with the Pythagorean theory and Pythagorean thought process of math. I'm not entirely sure. So there were some parts of this that were a little nebulous to me that I didn't really 100% understand every word of. I think mostly because it was math related and there was a lot of history kind of told about the Pythagoreans. Arthur and the main character figure out that a symbol that was left at the murder scene means that there's going to be more murders. So this ends up being sort of a serial killer hunt. I really did enjoy this. I loved reading a translated mystery, another translated mystery. I would love to just read more translated mysteries, more mysteries from all over the world that have been translated into English, because I think it's really interesting. Although the Oxford Murders is very English because it is set in England, and although the Mill House Murders was very English because it was an homage to English mysteries, I would love to know like more about mysteries from other places in the world. I started to watch the movie of the Oxford Diaries, but honestly it just felt like a long BBC show and I just wasn't that interested, partly because I knew what happened because I had just finished the book. So I didn't continue with that one. But I would recommend the book. The next book that I finished in March is The 39 Steps by John Buchan. This is a classic World War I mystery. It was written in 1915, but it takes place before World War I. And we meet our main character, let's see if he has a name, Hannah, who randomly lets a man into his flat because this man says that he needs help. So Hannah lets this man in and the man explains to him that he is dead. Hannah has to discover why this man is dead. And the man explains that he has information that the Germans are about to attack England and that all this political stuff is going on, that this man is the key and he has to get this information to other people, so he has faked his own death. And Hannah decides to help him. Hannah lets him stay in his house, but at the end of that week, long before this man is supposed to give this information to the higher ups in politics, the man is murdered in Hannah's flat. So Hannah realizes that the killers must know that the information that the man had, the man that was killed, they've given to Hannah, so Hannah goes on the run. And then this becomes like a really fun espionage thriller adventure where our main character is slipping into different roles. He's going on the run, he's changing characters, he's getting disguises and all of like this fun rompy adventure so that he can stay alive until the appointed meeting time so that he can tell the authorities what's going on, so that he can ideally, if not prevent war with Germany, he can at least give England a heads up of what's happening. Luckily, he has the dead man's journal and he's been able to decipher it. So Hannah just needs to stay alive until he can put that journal and that information in the right hands. So yeah, this one was just like a super fun romp. I liked Hannah as a character. He's very sly, he's very slick, but he's also very much an everyman in a lot of ways, and it was a super fun book. I've read most of these mysteries, but especially the 39 Steps for March Mystery Madness this year. March Mystery Madness is one of my all-time favorite readathons. I always read for it in March, and this year the theme is to the nines. So one of the prompts is to read a book with 9 on the cover or in the title, so the 39 Steps fits for that. But reading any mystery during March Mystery Madness counts toward the readathon, so I've read quite a few. When I read some more in March, I will come back to you. It is March 27th, and I have read 5 books since the last time we spoke in March, so I need to tell you all about them. The next book that I finished in March was The Last Devil to Die by Richard Osman. This is the 4th book in the Thursday Murder Club series, and this is the last one that he's going to be publishing for a little while. He has a new series, a cat cozy mystery series, coming out soon, which is very exciting. This one, I believe, was published in 2023, and it follows our ragtag bunch of octogenarians are senior citizens who all live in a senior development in England who solve crimes. Luckily, they all have pasts that help them do this. One person was an activist, one person was a nurse, one person worked for MI5 or some other shady government agency, one person is a psychologist, and we also see the police, the local police in the area who they've befriended. We see various criminals and saviors and savory and unsavory characters coming in and out of their lives who help them with what once started as solving cold case and now is solving actual murders and crimes. So this book, The Last Devil to Die, starts directly after the events of the third book, and we see their lives progressing. Joyce, Ibrahim, Ron, and Elizabeth and all these side characters, and we learn more about their lives and what's happening in them. In this book, a person that we met in a previous book turns up dead, and because he was, even though tangentially, a friend of the crew, they decide they need to solve his murder. We get wrapped up in diamonds and heroin and smuggling and all sorts of ridiculous things, and we meet new people, new potential allies, and new potential enemies. So I really like the Thursday Murder Club books. I just think that they are so much fun. They're super easy to read. They all fall in the like 350 to 400 page range, but they all read super quickly. They're super engaging. The chapters are super short, and each person has a very distinctive voice. So when we hear from Joyce, it's her writing in her journal. When we hear from, Ibrahim, it sounds one way. When we hear from Ron, it sounds one way. And then we also get chapters from other people that we're familiar with and people that we are not familiar with. They're just rollicking. They're fun. They're a romp. They're silly. They're extremely British, which I have often heard of as a detriment to these books, but personally, because I am an Anglophile and I love British humor and I was raised on British humor, I always think that they're, just right. So fun, great British humor. So I've also heard people say that the first book was hard for them to get into, but subsequent books weren't. So if you're having trouble with the first book, maybe push on and try to read the other books. I never had any trouble reading any of them, and I love them, but I'm also super excited to see something new from Richard Osman. The next book that I finished in March was Moon of the Turning Leaves, which is the sequel to Moon of the Crusted Snow by Washabig Rice. So I read Moon of the Crusted Snow last year, and actually it was on my 20 books I found out about in 2020 that I wanted to read in 2021 list. So I did start a vlog of that one, which I haven't read any other books off that list since then, so you will see a vlog with more of my thoughts of Moon of the Crusted Snow eventually at some point. But the general gist of Moon of the Crusted Snow is that a global catastrophe, apocalyptic issue happens in the world, and the book revolves around how that impacts a community living on a reservation in Canada. So already living on this reservation, many of the Anishinaabe tribe that are living there are trying to get back to their roots, and our main character Evan and his wife are doing just that. They're trying to learn the Anishinaabe language, they're trying to hunt for their food a little bit more, they're trying to prepare for the winter, and as they're doing so, this global catastrophe takes hold, and the elders and the community board of the reservation have to decide what to do. So Moon of the Crusted Snow follows them living on the reservation, coming to terms with what is going on, being in this very isolated place, and the threats that try to encroach their reservations. Some from the outside world, some from this global catastrophe, and maybe even some from inside their compound. The Moon of the Turning Leaves takes place 10 years after Moon of the Crusted Snow, and we see the people from Moon of the Crusted Snow having made decisions and having created a life for themselves under these new worldly expectations and their own expectations of their tribe and of their community and of their reservation. And we see that where they are now, they're facing new problems that they haven't had to face for 10 years. So they are definitely facing food scarcity again and various other trials and tribulations that are going on, and they decide to send out a party of people. They haven't had any real contact aside from a very few people who have come into their community since the global catastrophe happened over 10 years ago. In Moon of the Turning Leaves, the community is finally deciding that they are going to need to find out what happened, if not to the whole rest of the world, at least to some of the world outside their reservation and their community. So it follows Evan again as he and his daughter travel out with a group of people out of the safety of their community and into a wider world and what they find there. It was a little bit less horror in its genre, a little bit more, I would say, like thriller slash adventure. Not thriller in the way you think of thriller, like, you know, like a murder thriller mystery, but more as like a thrilling adventure story than Moon of the Crusted Snow. Moon of the Crusted Snow had this extremely claustrophobic, cold, anxiety-provoking atmosphere, and there is some anxiety in Moon of the Turning Leaves, but it leaves behind the reservation and therefore also leaves behind that claustrophobic, small kind of community atmosphere. And maybe one of the things that is terrifying and scary about Moon of the Turning Leaves is that you have this small group that cares deeply about each other, and they're in this wild world. They're in this huge expanse of space and time that they are not familiar with. And you as the reader and they as the group have no idea what's going to happen out in the wider world and have no idea what they're going to find there. And so there's almost like the opposite of claustrophobic. It's almost like agoraphobic, where everything seems too big, too broad, too wide to encompass, and therefore scary. So I really enjoyed this one as well. I think it had the same reader. I read this on audio. It is so atmospheric. The atmosphere is different, but along with the Native American accent of the reader and a lot of Anishinaabe language in this book, more so even than was in the last book, and there was quite a bit in the last book as well, it just gives you a real immersive feeling, and I really enjoyed listening to this one, and I'm very excited to see what else Washer Big Rice comes out with, what other books he might write. Strictly speaking, you don't have to read Moon of the Crusted Snow first, but I would. Moon of the Crusted Snow is very short, and then Moon of the Turning Leaves was quite a bit longer, but I think it's worth reading both of them just because it is one kind of long, continuous story to a certain extent. The next book that I finished in March was Mrs. Polifax and the Hong Kong Buddha by Dorothy Gilman. This is a book that I had in my basement box books and that I recently found in my basement box book unboxings. This is a classic American mystery author from New Jersey, and this book was written, I believe, in 1988. Oh, no, 1985. She has a long series of books that follow Mrs. Polifax, who is a older woman. It's a little bit unclear how old she actually is, but it's funny that this hopped on the senior detective train long before Richard Osman was there. So Mrs. Polifax is a older senior lady, and from what I gathered from this book, which is like the 8th in the series, but the only one that I had, got kind of tired of being retired, and she became a CIA agent. So in Mrs. Polifax and the Hong Kong Buddha, we see her setting up home with her new husband, which obviously find out about more her marriage and her life in previous books, but she's setting up her new house in New Jersey when her CIA handler contacts her and asks her to go to Hong Kong to look for a young man who she met on a previous mission. So because she was emotionally attached to this young man, she ends up going right to Hong Kong, and she's a amateur sleuth, but she's also trained in karate and Tai Chi, and she speaks different languages, and she is a world traveler, so she is amateur in some respects, but she is also trained in some respects. She seems to have a knack for finding people like the young man that she's going to find in this book who are helpful to her and who she helps, and therefore become allies in her detective work, in her CIA agent work. On the plane on the way to Hong Kong, she meets a man who is going there to find a missing police officer who happens to be a psychic. And as she learns more about his life, and as she gets to Hong Kong and finds out more about her mission, it turns out that their two agendas are going to merge. So this is a very short, very fun, very fast-paced murder mystery in the style of Dorothy Simpson, P.D. James, and Agatha Christie. So that kind of period. But the period after the Golden Age of Mysteries, the period after or at the tail end of some of those people were writing. So it has a very distinctly like 1980s, 1990s feel. Mrs. Polifax definitely has ideas about the world and what's going on in the world in the current day, her current day of 1985. So she does talk a lot about things that are changing politically, fashion, and things like that. So it was a really, really fun read, having grown up in the 80s, having been a 90s child. It had a lot more things that I would remember or nostalgic ideas than some of the other 1980s mysteries I read, like Dorothy Simpson, because Dorothy Simpson's books are all set in England and she's a British writer, she's an English writer, whereas Dorothy Gilman is an American writer. So I really had super fun with this. I really enjoyed it. Super fast read, super easy, quite suspenseful, quite thrilling for what it was, but also very tame. Definitely nothing too gory or gruesome. So a very, very fun classic mystery, and I look forward to finding more Dorothy Gilman books and reading more of the Mrs. Polifax series. The next book I read for Duwithon, which is the Welsh readathon that happens every year in March, and I read The White People by Arthur Mention. I read this on audio. Last year I read The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, and I really enjoyed that one. I will say that I think The Great God Pan went a little over my head, and it was a little bit of a vibey, ethereal, untethered kind of read, although it did have, I think, a distinct plot, like overall. Maybe not in every single little part of the book, but overall. The White People follows similar themes of occultism and spirituality and supernatural happenings and going on, but I would say that this one is like all vibes. All vibes. The White People starts out with two men talking about the nature of good and evil, talking about the potential for good and evil, and the idea that nothing can be wholly good or wholly evil, and the evil that men do is not necessarily true evil, and what true evil is. So these two men are talking, and the kind of senior of the men brings out a volume, a diary of a young woman to kind of prove his point. So our young man, our young protagonist, goes away and reads this account. So the majority of The White People is the account that's happening in this diary, and within this diary, the young woman writing it is telling her own story, but she's also telling stories that her nan told her and that she has learned from other people or that correspond with stories that she has in her life. And that part is like, it's all vibes. It's just basically stories about like supernatural occurrences and occult occurrences, fairies, fae, the idea of the white people and the good and evil potential of the white people, and in these stories and these recollections. And then when we return to the two young men, they talk more about this particular diary, this volume. So I really enjoyed it. I think there's a very, like I said, ethereal kind of untetheredness. You must suspend your disbelief and you must let yourself be taken in by these stories and by this rambling account of what's going on without any ending, without any resolution to the stories, without any solid final thesis of these books. But I really, really enjoyed them. They're very magical and mystical and beautifully written, so fun to immerse yourself in. The White People is very, very short. I think it was only like an hour and 45 minutes or something on audio, and reading it a little bit faster, you get through it really quickly. I did have to go back a couple times in the audio and re-listen to certain parts, because I definitely feel like I missed something, especially at the end. I was confused that there was no kind of definite ending or conclusion to the ideas that were set out by the author in the beginning of the book. So it felt a little meandering, this one, but I would definitely read more of his work because I think he's a really interesting writer and I really enjoy his writing, even if I don't fully understand it. The latest book that I have finished in March, I actually finished this morning, and that was Bitter by Akwaeke Emeze. I read Bitter, which is the prequel to Pet for the the Trans Right Readathon this past weekend, and I'm really excited that I did because when I read Pet a few years ago, I really enjoyed it, and I was super excited when Emeze announced that they were putting out a prequel all about Jam's mom. So Pet follows Jam, who is a young trans girl living in Lucille, which is a seemingly utopian society or city that her mother and father helped create. So Jam has a best friend, and they go to school, and they have things, good things and bad things that happen in their life, but Jam unexpectedly meets Pet, who appears out of one of her mother's paintings, and Pet, which is a huge, crazy looking, at first very scary monster to Jam. Pet lets Jam know that something is wrong in Lucille and someone is being hurt and there is a monster around. Jam has to come to grips with the idea that this monster looking thing in front of her, Pet, is not a monster. One of the foundings of Lucille is that there are no monsters left in Lucille. So part of the adventure that Pet and Jam go on is to understand that although the major monsters and horrible things that were abolished from Lucille, it's always a battle that they have to fight. They may have abolished some of them, but they will return, and it is something that they have to be constantly vigilant for. So in Bitter, we meet Bitter, who is Jam's mom, and we later meet Aloe, who is going to become Jam's dad. Bitter is an artist. She has been shuttled around the foster care system, and she's finally found a home at Eucalyptus, which is a school for artists and a very safe haven in Lucille. This is at a time before the monsters were abolished from Lucille, and Lucille is a riotous and warring city, a warring place. Bitter feels super happy that she is in Eucalyptus, and she doesn't have to be part of those warring factions, but her best friend, her best friend's girlfriend, other friends that she knows are part of this war, and they are trying to make Lucille a better place. So the majority of the book, Bitter, is about Bitter kind of deciding how she can help and figuring out that she is part of the fight for good, even if she can't be someone on the front lines. We also find out how giant creatures and other things emerge from Bitter's paintings, how that came to be, and why Bitter and the other kids at Eucalyptus might be the linchpin to the war raging in the city of Lucille. I really enjoyed seeing more about Lucille, more about this world that Akwaeke Emeze has created, and how people in Bitter and Jam's world are constantly fighting and vigilant and trying to make the world a better place, to have equality, to abolish monsters, the people who perpetuate violence and hate and racism, etc., etc. Reading Bitter, I really thought a lot about Weetsibat. I think when I first read Pet, especially because Pet is kind of marketed as a middle grade, and I definitely think these are YA, not middle grade, and maybe even upper YA at that, just because of some of the languages they use, certainly because of the immense amount of violence and about the adult themes. I think when I was reading Pet, I couldn't really see the world building and the kind of magical found family, casual queerness, and all those things in comparison to Weetsibat. I liked all those things about the book, and obviously I did see them, but reading Bitter and learning more about this world and learning more about Lucille and learning more about all the people, it's such a magical and comforting and nostalgic kind of feeling, and it really reminded me of Weetsibat and how bad things happen and sadness happens and depression happens and anxiety happens and disabledness happens and other things that could be considered monsters in and of themselves happen to individuals, but how the characters really learn to live through those things, to relish in their own individualism and their personalities, and how the true monsters are, you know, the police indiscriminately killing Black people, or the policies put in place that are racist, or the money and capitalism that is keeping people from being able to live full and rich lives. So I think it's just like a really great world and beautiful messaging. Definitely strong messaging and like hits you over the head a little bit, but I think because they are designed for YA readers, for young readers, that it makes sense why they're a little obvious maybe, or a little like blatant in their language and in describing the ideas that they are putting forth. I really loved Bitter, and I hope I can get a physical copy at some point because I would love to have the whole Pet Bitter universe and be able to revisit it when I want to. Bonnie Turpin read the audiobook though, and she's amazing, so I would definitely suggest reading this on audio if you're interested. And I'd also hope that Akwaeke Emezi writes more of these books because I'm really just like in love with this world. So those were 5 more books that I read in March, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is March 31st and I'm not going to finish any more books in March, so I thought I would talk about the last books that I read in March and do my wrap up of the wrap up. The next book that I read in March was Original Sin by P.D. James. This is one of the Adam Dalgliesh mysteries, and I have been working my way through the Adam Dalgliesh series for quite a while now, but I've been reading them out of order. Series that I'm reading out of order, I tend to read like whatever, whenever, except if I have a bunch of the books, I tend to pick the book that's the most, or the oldest in the series, the closest to the beginning of the series, and read them that way. So if I have 6, 8, and 10, I'll read 6 first, then 8, then 10. But because the theme for March Mystery Madness this year was to the 9s, I decided to read the 9th book in the series, Original Sin. So this is one of the long ones. This was 416 pages, but I just find that P.D. James's writing is so engaging and captivating. It just reads so quickly. I think I read this in 2 or 3 days. It's so easy to get immersed in the story, and it's so easy to want to continue reading, and they don't really feel like very long books. This one has to do with a publishing house which is situated in a old kind of mansion that's modeled after Venice. It sits right on the Thames, and this publishing house of course has a cast of characters in it, and in the very beginning we find out that there have been practical jokes that have been played, there have been manuscripts that have been misplaced or lost, and various other things, and so they're already a little bit on edge when one of their part-time editors commits suicide in the offices that have been converted from this mansion. So that's kind of how the book starts, and we meet all the people who work at this publishing house, and we find out that one of the people publishing a book through them has asked Adam Dalgliesh to look into things because they're suspicious of what's going on there. Adam Dalgliesh turns them down. He doesn't really think it's a police matter yet, and if it was, the people from the publishing house would contact him. So eventually there is a murder there, and of course Adam Dalgliesh goes in knowing that some of the things have happened, and the majority of this book is Adam Dalgliesh and Kate Mishkin and their new other sergeant that they work with, because the sergeant that they had previously been working with for a long time, Missingham, has changed careers and gone on to do something else. So this new sergeant is with them, and they've had a couple of cases together, and there's a little bit of tension between him and Mishkin because she's the senior officer on the case, and it's very much an Adam Dalgliesh book. I love when P.D. James talks about writing and writers and publishing because she obviously has a very, first-hand knowledge of these things, and she obviously also has a lot to say about it. She talks a lot of funny stuff about like writers and publishers and how publishing works in this book, but also like some serious things too, and she does talk a little bit about ageism and why certain books are published and who works in publishing and things like that. So it was a really fun one. It was definitely a little bit long, but like I said, you get so immersed in the characters that you don't mind that much. I do believe that there is a shorter version of this one, and it's called Innocent House. So I don't know if at some point they just wanted it to be shorter or people weren't buying it or what. So I would be interested to get a copy of that just to see what it's like, but I don't think I would read another copy of this until I read the full series in order, which I do plan on doing at some point in the future. The next book and the last book that I read in March was Ghost Dust by Emmanuel de Pascal. Emmanuel de Pascal is an Italian author who moved to New Jersey and has lived in New Jersey for the last like 60 years or something. I picked this up at my local indie/used bookstore. This was a used book for $1, and I got it because I love to just pick up random poetry books. This is a book of poetry, but it had place names that I recognized, and I realized that it was from New Jersey, and then I also realized that the press, Blast Press, is actually in Cliffwood, New Jersey, which is right next to the town where my mom lives and where I grew up. So I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to give it a try. This is not a very good book of poetry. It does have some collected poems from Pasquale over the last couple of decades, and I think it has some newer poems as well. And what I did like about it was that there was a lot of reoccurring themes and even some reoccurring titles, like there's Spring Storm in Long Branch, there's Fall Storm in Long Branch. So it's like him being in the same place at different times and writing poetry about his experience. There's also quite a bit about like God and Jesus. Some of those were interesting, but for the most part, these poems were pretty like meh, like they just weren't engaging or enticing. The ones about Long Branch and the Jersey Shore were the ones that were most interesting to me, but I don't know if they would be good for people who were not familiar with those places and those feelings and those ideas. Also, this poetry collection is just written in a really horrible font. Why you would put it in like a weird font is beyond me, and why you would make it like such large print is beyond me. Also, this poetry collection is only this long, and this half of the book is about the press. It has a little author's note, but it has about other books that the press released, and it has a bunch of blank pages, so it's like a very strange, I mean, it's a chapbook, I guess, so, you know, you get a certain amount of pages and you just have to fill them, but it seems odd that they wouldn't have put a little more poetry in there. So overall, not the best book to end the month with, but not a bad book because I haven't read a book of poetry in March besides this one, so I'm always glad to read more poetry. This month I did read a lot of mysteries for March Mystery Madness. One has a New Jersey character, a classic, and the fourth of the Thursday Murder Club books, which was really fun. I also read in the beginning of the month The Naked Detective, which was a fun one. I read several translated mysteries, which was great. I'm really getting into reading translated mysteries, and that's something that I've been wanting to do. I read a memoir that will be showing up in a Savage Prompts vlog at some point, and I did read a book of poetry. Oh, I also read a book for Duwithon, The White People. I read a sequel to a horror that I read last year, Moon of the Turning Leaves. So many good things. I read the second in the Decagon House Murders, or the House Murders. I read Concerning My Mother, which was a great Korean translated work. And I'm excited to look at all my stats for this first quarter now that March is over and see how my goals are doing, where I am with my stats, and figure out what I need to be reading more of in the second quarter of the year. So overall, a really great reading month. I got to read a ton of my favorite genre. I got to read a ton of mystery, which I'm always happy about, and really it's something that I crave reading all the time. And I try to get myself out of the habit of doing that, because if it were up to me, I would probably just read the majority mysteries every month of the year. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here, and let me know what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!